Well, today we're talking about another famous and influential man named Jordan Peterson. And let me preface this by saying that we've never received the level of interest for any topic or any person that we have for Jordan Peterson. I think we've got at least 50 emails and comments and tweets requesting that Bishop Barron comment on the whole Jordan Peterson phenomenon. So this is clearly something people have been clamoring for a while. Bishop, before we get into who he is and some of his main ideas, let me give you a little bit of brief background for those unfamiliar with him. So Jordan Peterson is a Canadian clinical psychologist. He's a cultural critic, a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. He's written 2 books in his life. One was a massive and very complex book called The Maps of Meaning. I think came out about a decade ago. But then he just released a book a few weeks ago titled 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And this book has been the #1 best-selling book overall on Amazon.com and basically every country. #1 in America, #1 in England, #1 in Canada. And it's sat on the top of the list for several weeks now. So clearly this is somebody who's resonating with the culture. The Spectator says that he's one of the most important thinkers to emerge on the world stage for many years. He's also exploded on YouTube. His YouTube channel has 40 million views, almost 1 million subscribers. And he does these long 2 or 3 hour lectures on the Bible that get millions of views. So a really interesting and unique phenomenon. Bishop, let me ask you this initial question. How did you first come across Jordan Peterson, and what were your initial impressions?
I first came across the name through our, I think, YouTube page. So people make comments, and ask questions. And I look at those as they come in. And I began to notice people saying, hey, you remind me of Jordan Peterson, or getting a lot of Jordan Peterson vibe here. Especially, remember the one I did on Kathy Griffin? Remember that one? And she had the severed head of the president, all that stuff. And I remember at the time thinking, I don't know who Jordan Peterson is. Never heard of him. And so I think I Googled him or something and got the basic, okay, he's a professor of psychology. So then more and more, I would say at least once a week, I'd have someone saying, hey, this is like Jordan Peterson. When are you going to talk to Jordan Peterson? So then I began to get more interested, and I began to look at his work. And here's what first struck me is I'm thinking, okay, he's going to be some real pop sort of guy. And he's obviously appealing very broadly. So it's going to be a, maybe somewhat superficial, slick presentation. Well, I go on the website and I find here's a guy. The first one I came across, actually, he's sitting in a poorly lit room on a like a folding chair. He's got a microphone, hooked on. He's got a book open on his lap. And what's the book? It's the Beyond Good and Evil of Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the densest philosophical texts of the 19th century. And he starts talking in a pretty serious professorial way about this book. And I'm thinking, wow, this is the guy that is getting so much attention. And I mean that very much as a compliment, that he was really engaging things pretty seriously. And I took it as a sign of hope, that, wow, that a lot of people are watching this sort of thing. So then I began to listen to him more carefully, and I kind of got the gist of what he was driving at. And then finally, I got around to this book that just came out, which, I read with great interest. So anyway, that's how I kind of got into the Jordan Peterson thing.
Well, again, this Jordan Peterson phenomenon has just exploded. He's been profiled in virtually every major newspaper, long pieces, trying to figure out why is this guy suddenly have this massive following, especially among young men. We're going to get to that here in a minute. So what we decided to do was we're going to do 2 podcast episodes on Jordan Peterson. This first one, we're going to look at some of his main ideas, some of his intellectual influences, talk about why he especially is drawing such a large audience among young men. And then in the second episode next week, we'll look at Jordan Peterson and Catholicism. So how should Catholics look at some of his key ideas and his psychological approach to the Bible and all that good stuff. So got a couple of good episodes here for you. Bishop, let's start with some of his main intellectual influences. Jordan Peterson did not emerge from a vacuum. He's the latest figure in a long line of intellectual forefathers. Let's maybe start with the most prominent one, Carl Jung. His name pops up again and again in Peterson's books and lectures. Who was Carl Jung? What were some of his main ideas?
Yeah, Carl Jung was the most prominent disciple of Sigmund Freud. So very early on, he gets on the Freud bandwagon. But then, still as a fairly young man, he breaks with Freud for a number of reasons. But one of them was he thought was Freud's obsession with sexuality. And Jung became interested in this sort of far-reaching implications of psychology and the deeper grounds of psychology, precisely in what he called the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And we'll talk a little bit more about those, but call them instincts, ideas, patterns of thought and behavior that are so fundamental to us that they influence and shape much of our philosophy and our religion and our culture. They pop up in myth and story and legend, etc. Right? And so Jung begins to explore all this business in his individual therapy, of suffering people, but also in his broader cultural analyses. Someone that was very influenced by Carl Jung was Joseph Campbell, the comparative mythologist, who then influenced George Lucas, who made the Star Wars movies. And Star Wars, you can see a lot of Carl Jung's psychology. I think in many ways, Jordan Peterson is doing for this time what Campbell did, let's say, a generation ago, is he's making the Jungian approach. I don't mean, he's not popularizing it in some crude way. I think he's making it very provocatively accessible to people today. So Jung is clearly a big influence on Jordan Peterson.
Does Jung still have a lot of traction among mainstream scholars today? I mean, is his influence still going strong, or is Peterson just sort of an aberration?
No, I find that Jung, because he's delving into these properly archetypal realities, has a real staying power, because it's hard to deny that these things he's uncovering really are basic and fundamental in much of our religion, mythology, poetry, storytelling. So in that way, there's something very perennial about Jung. I'd say this, that, go back in the Catholic world, maybe 30, 40 years ago, there was a real vogue of Carl Jung. I read him very seriously, maybe about 20 years ago. I went through a period where I read a lot of Jung. We had a great professor at Mundelein, Bible man, and they were like Jordan Peterson, a man who read the Bible in a Jungian way, Father Jim Doyle. And he piqued my interest in Carl Jung. And I, at one point, as I say, read a lot of Jung and Jungian commentators. So there's something, I think, fairly perennial about Carl Jung. And again, it's as present as the Star Wars movies.
You mentioned the Bible as influential for Jung, and it's certainly influential for Jordan Peterson. He talks a lot about the Bible, particularly the Old Testament stories, and even more specifically those in Genesis. This, I think, is part of the reason for his popularity, is whereas the rest of the culture just dismisses the Bible as just this old, antiquated set of fairy tales, Peterson takes it very seriously and thinks it has great value for anybody today. Talk about the Bible's influence on Peterson.
Well, see, think about this. Is anyone who has done a moment's reflection knows that a set of texts like the Bible that have been around as long as they have, that have influenced culture as profoundly as they have, there's something going on here of enormous power. And I'm saying it now with that little sarcastic edge, because the Bill Maher's and the Christopher Hitchens and the Richard Dawkins of the world, with this, as you know, in my judgment, eminently stupid, superficial reading of the Bible. It's just old, science. It's pre-scientific nonsense. It's Bronze Age mythology. That sort of thing, which sadly has influenced a lot of young people, is so obviously stupid. And I think someone like Peterson has seen that these texts would not have been around as long as they have, would not have influenced the greatest minds and spirits of the world, unless there was something of enormous value in them. My feeling is that what Peterson uncovers is part of that, not the whole thing, and we'll get to that, but part of why these texts are of such enormous influence, because they contain much of this, call it archetypal truth, regarding nature, regarding human behavior, regarding maturity, regarding God. And see, thank God for him there, I would say, because he gets past this silly Sam Harris sort of approach to the Bible, which has tragically influence way too many young people. That's where I thank God for Jordan Peterson. And I'd say this too. I'll say this too. It's a bit of a self-indictment that we as a church have not been very good at explaining the Bible. The very fact that so many young people were just swept away by the stupidities of Christopher Hitchens is a sign that we religious people have not been very good at explaining the Bible. Either we get a crude fundamentalism, which is the same problem. See, that's just the flip side of the Sam Harris coin, is a crude Christian fundamentalism. Or we get a sort of bland, historical, critical reductionism. And we don't unpack and unleash the spiritual, psychological power of these texts. And so there, I think the emergence of Jordan Peterson as a biblical reader is a sign of grace.
You've often said that the preacher, especially at Mass, should be a tour guide to the densely textured, fascinating world of the Bible, which is admittedly as difficult to get through as a real jungle. I think that's part of Jordan Peterson's powers. He can spend 2 or 3 hours serving as a tour guide to just 1 or 2 chapters in Genesis, and people are just enthralled because here's someone who doesn't dismiss these texts, but says these are endlessly fascinating. The more we study them, the more facets of them we see, the more that we gain. I want to talk about another couple of influences on him. We've mentioned Carl Jung. We've mentioned the Bible. How about Friedrich Nietzsche? His name pops up a lot in Peterson's work. What's the interaction there?
Yeah, and here, I maybe balk a little bit. I'm a pretty sharp critic of Nietzsche for obvious reasons. Most religious people are. Peterson is influenced by him, as Jung was. And that's I think, where you trace the genealogy of ideas. Nietzsche is a major player. I think as Peterson reads him, Nietzsche announces the death of God, but not as a triumph, but as something of a tragedy. And what he means there, I think, is, the collapse of older forms of religion, or the collapse of inadequate understandings of God. But what Nietzsche intuited, according to Peterson, is what a tragedy this was, and how it opened the door to a kind of nihilism. What was Jung doing, as Peterson reads him, but trying to respond now in the wake of Nietzsche's critique? How do we fill that void so we don't simply have a nihilism? And Jung, I think, filled it with a lot of this archetypal psychology. So that's how I see, in Peterson's reading, the relationship between Nietzsche and Jung. That Nietzsche is a great, important philosopher. Yes, indeed. I'm somewhat more skeptical of Nietzsche. I'm more skeptical than Jordan Peterson is.
The one book that pops up most often in Jordan Peterson's work is a classic titled The Gulag Archipelago, which was authored by the great critic of Soviet Russia, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Talk about who he is, first of all, and why does he seem to be so important for Peterson?
Yeah, and I'm just kind of getting a handle on this. It comes up in his most recent book and elsewhere too. Solzhenitsyn, this great figure, Russian, who was a victim of really both the Nazi tyranny and especially the Soviet tyranny, spends decades in these awful prison camps, what he called the Gulag Archipelago, this archipelago of prison camps all over Russia, suffered from cancer. I mean, like tragedy after tragedy. I think what Peterson finds so intriguing about Solzhenitsyn is he stands, as it were, on a razor's edge. On the one side, he could very easily have fallen into simply a bitterness and a despair and a hatred of the world and of God and of his fate, right? Or what he in fact did was look deeply into himself and to find resources for meaning and for purpose in himself, even to the point of recognizing his own contribution to the degradations of the Soviet Union, that in his early years he was a supporter to some degree. That sort of honest self-searching gave him a clarity of vision and a sort of moral integrity, which allowed him at the propitious moment to write the great book, to tell the great truth in the face of all the lies that produced the Soviet oppression and the Gulag Archipelago. So he sees Solzhenitsyn, I think, as a kind of a saint of our time. We can slide into despair, or we can I'll use his language, stand up straight, throw our shoulders back, live responsibly, see the world and ourselves with moral and intellectual clarity. And this can make a difference in indeed the changing of the world, because it's no exaggeration to say that Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago played a major role in the unraveling of the Soviet Union. I want to underestimate John Paul II's role as well, but Solzhenitsyn's a major player in, as it were, pulling back the curtain to reveal what's really going on. So I think Peterson quite correctly sees him as sort of a saint of moral clarity and truth-telling and courage in the face of the darkness of the world. And I think that makes him an important player indeed.
It was in the Gulag Archipelago that we find that famous Solzhenitsyn quote, probably his most famous one, that the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, which gets to me at the heart of Peterson's thing, that small actions matter. You matter. One of Peterson's thing he says often is with every moment and every decision, you're tilting, either closer to heaven or closer to hell. You're tilting the whole earth closer to heaven or closer to hell.
And that brings him close to a lot of our own spiritual masters and teachers, I think. But also, as I was saying about Solzhenitsyn, it's so easy for someone like him to have said, oh, look, I am a victim of this horrible oppression, these awful, awful people. I'm on the side of light. They're on the side of darkness. True, substantially, yes. But that very, very telling bit of self-exploration to say that the line between good and evil runs right through me too. I'm not totally innocent here. I contributed to the darkness of the world. And that kind of moral clarity and honesty and humility can lead to the tilting the world in the right direction.
You're listening to the Word on Fire show, and I'm with Bishop Robert Barron. We're discussing Jordan Peterson, who has kind of exploded on the scene to become maybe the most influential intellectual of our day, at least right now. He certainly has a lot of resonance in the popular culture. We've looked at some of his main intellectual influences. Let's move, Bishop, to some of his main ideas. These are the ones that pop up again and again in his lectures and in his books. Probably the most famous one is the one from which he takes the subtitle of his book. The book, again, is titled 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. He often puts these two things against each other, order and chaos. That's how he begins his whole book. What does he mean by that? What is he getting at?
I liked his thing on Taoism, and we all know the great symbol of the Tao, right? Like the two intertwining fish, you might say. One, I don't know, they're different colors and so on. And what they symbolize, he thinks, is the play between order and chaos that's happening both outside in the world and very much inside us. And that what the right harmony comes not from the elimination of chaos or from the elimination of order, but from the very creative dynamic play between the two. So his example with human consciousness, without order, we wouldn't be able to stand. I mean, so you and I right now are living in a very orderly world that's enabling us to speak to each other across a continent. I'm looking at words on a screen that you're conveying your thoughts to me, et cetera. My car is sitting out there, which will enable me to drive someplace. All of that is a function of order, and my psyche takes all that in as part of an orderly world. Okay. But what's the danger if everything is order? The danger is a kind of complacency, getting stuck, no novelty, creativity. There has to be in a healthy consciousness not only order, but a sort of invitation from the chaotic, if you want, a willingness to explore, to go outside of the realm of order and to find something precious that has not yet been found. Now, the minute you say that, what should come to mind are all the great myths of the heroes, right, across the cultures, from Gilgamesh to Bilbo Baggins, right, that someone's got to leave the Shire. The Shire is great. Bilbo loves the Shire, comfortable, well-known, tidy. He knows everybody. Everything's under control. Great, but if all you do is stay in the Shire, you invite a sort of torpor. You invite a complacency. Bilbo's got to go on an adventure. Remember that wonderful, it's in The Hobbit, isn't it? As he's running down the road. Where are you going? I'm going on an adventure. Well, that's the beginning of the move out of simple order into something like chaos. But then what happens is you got to bring something back from the chaos. If you simply fall into chaos, that's no good either. You simply leave all order behind and, welcome to chaos. That's not it. It's the heroic journey into chaos, into the new, the creative, the different, the other, and then to find something that you can bring back and expand the realm of order, if that makes sense. Okay, and then there's a rhythm, because that realm of order will eventually become oppressive, and a new hero's got to go out. The show we both like very much, Vikings, that begins that way, doesn't it? Is the Viking community, and they're doing okay, and they go on their little local raids and all that. But then, what's his name again? Ragnar, right? Right? No, man, I've heard about this island. You got to go across the sea, though. It's really a risk. But if we go there, we're going to get so much more. Well, oh no, you can't do that. And oh no, you'll die and you'll fall off the end of the world and you'll be drowned. Well, see, that's the danger of chaos. But Ragnar is the hero who sets out, conquers it, and indeed brings back something from the realm of chaos that increases the realm of order. Okay. And that's what I like very much in Peterson, is the way he's re-inhabiting that old archetype of the hero.
Peterson uses those lenses of order and chaos to interestingly read the story of Eden. He does that in the beginning of his new book, 12 Rules for Life. How does he do that?
Yeah, interesting. And the roots here, I know exactly the genealogy because I studied Paul Tillich when I was doing my doctoral work. And Tillich was very indebted to Hegel. And Hegel is behind everyone, and that certainly includes Nietzsche and so on. The reading here is this, and there's something to it. Adam and Eve in the garden are in a good place, and they're in a safe place, right? However, it's more like the Tillich's language, the dreaming innocence of a child. So a child living in his safe world, good, and that's appropriate, for a time. But see, what is, and you know this, Brandon, with all your kids, what do kids begin to feel at a certain point? I got to get out of the garden. I got to get out of simple domesticity where everything's taken care of. Now, every kid from time immemorial makes this transition awkwardly. That's why we talk about awkward teenagers, right? Because the move out of the home is usually a fall. It's like a tumble into something bad. There really is a bad dimension to it. However, in the biblical story, Adam and Eve are prevented by the angel from coming simply back into the garden. See, because now they're launched upon, here they stand for the whole human race, they're launched upon, if you want a spiritual adventure, is how to find the right relationship to God, but outside the garden of dreaming innocence. There's something like the adventure into chaos. Now read all of biblical history. Just this morning, in the Office of Readings, the great, still stirring story of Israel coming up against the Red Sea. And there's Moses, with his staff and the waters open. Well, see, what does that mean? But that's a journey into chaos. They leave the order of Egypt. And in fact, the people, oh no, let's go back. At least we had enough to eat. Well, that's the draw back into simple order, which actually is a type of slavery. And then Moses saying, no, have confidence, go forward into this more chaotic space, which then leads to the promised land, etc. So that's, I think, very richly a psychological way to read some of these great texts.
Another thing you'll see very often in Jordan Peterson's work, and he gets this, of course, from Carl Jung, is the idea of archetypes or archetypal ideas or people. In fact, I think he says that Jesus is the archetype of the perfect man. What does he mean by archetypes? What are these?
Yeah, I think earlier I said it this way, a set of fundamental intuitions, ideas, patterns of thought and behavior. Jung himself felt that, you have to go way back to the beginnings of the human race, and that some of this is actually, Jung thought, hardwired into the brain itself. These, call them patterns, whereby human beings have sort of made sense of their lives and of the wider world. And these archetypes are reflected in so much of the poetry and legend and ritual practice of the human race. Ritual, you might say, is like a waking dream. It's like an acting out of certain archetypal realities. these archetypes link us to all of the human beings. That's part of their power. If they're really elemental to the human experience, that's why, for example, Star Wars is popular all over the world. That's why everybody responds to it. Why certain like fairy tales and legends and myths are so perennially powerful, because they speak to and they awaken these archetypes. Why certain dreams seem to be recurrent in the human race. Jung, of course, found that extremely interesting. The dreams that we have often reveal these archetypal patterns, etc.
Something that I really appreciate in Peterson's work, because I hear undertones of Catholic spiritual wisdom in it, is his emphasis that life is suffering and suffering is inevitable, but suffering can become meaningful through sacrifice. Did you pick up that all the echoes of the Catholic spiritual masters in that line?
I appreciated his approach to that, because that's a Buddhist principle. All life is suffering. And people say, oh, come on, that can't be right. But see, what's going on there, I think, is that there's just something inevitable about the fact of suffering and pain. It doesn't mean like every single moment is suffering. It just means that suffering will always accompany whatever we do, wherever we go. So Buddhism has it there. Peterson would say in Christianity, it's symbolized by the cross, the centrality of the cross. And then sacrifice is what? Not just the acceptance of dumb suffering for its own sake, but it's a way of dealing with this truth that suffering can become itself redemptive. We use that language. Suffering accepted in the right spirit can become a way forward. So yeah, that has overtones, obviously, for the whole idea of sacrifice in a religious context. Why religious people from time immemorial have engaged in this practice, and why something like sacrificial love is at the heart of Christianity. Someone that accepts suffering, but in a sacrificial spirit, which redeems the world. So yes, that has enormous overtones for us.
Let's look at one of his final main ideas here. You could put it simply by saying small things matter. He says, as I quoted earlier, that every action, every day, you're choosing to tilt the world a little closer to heaven or a little closer to hell. And so, he says, the best way to change the world is to don't lie, tell the truth. He says, before trying to change the world, clean up your room and get your own house in order. What do you think about all that advice?
I really liked it a lot. As I read that section of the book, I kept writing Augustine in the margin, because you know how strong Augustine is on truth telling. And I think Aquinas is probably more correct in making a few nuances there. But Augustine had an absolutely rigorous view that you may not tell an untruth, that it runs so counter to the purpose of human speech. And I think it's really good, though, the way he recovers that for our time, because he sees quite correctly the totalitarianisms flourished in a network and jungle of lies. It's lies about the human being, about God, about society, about the economy, about the other, etc. All these lies made it possible. Think of Hitler here as very useful, because Hitler famously said, is lies, the bigger the lie, the more persuasive it is. And he did it all the time. He lied in a big way, and that had a big impact on shaping society in a deeply dysfunctional way. And so you want to battle oppression and tyranny, totalitarianism, start by not telling lies. Start by telling the truth and being careful in your speech and articulating the way things are. Because what happens is every time you lie, you open up a wider space for dysfunction, And every time you tell the truth, you widen the space for beauty and for goodness. Here he's very much like Václav Havel, the Czech poet and playwright who then led some of the rebellion against the Soviet Union and then became, strangely, the president of the Czech Republic. But Václav Havel said that, is that every time we speak the truth, we increase the space where people can stand in the truth. Then the more people stand, the bigger the space gets, and the more truth is said. And that's how he read what happened in 1989. It wasn't a bloody rebellion. It was a spiritual rebellion. It was people telling the truth. And so I very much resonated with that.
Let's spend the last few minutes of this episode backing out and just looking at the Jordan Peterson phenomenon in general. I mentioned some of the stats at the beginning, tens of millions of views, #1 best-selling book. He does these dense intellectual lectures that get millions of views. I want to talk specifically about his effect on young men in a moment, but in general, why do you think he's become so massively popular?
Well, I think one is the Jungian thing, that when you tap into that, you're going to tap into something which is very fundamental. And Joseph Campbell knew that. When Campbell wasn't a well-known figure, but at the end of his life, he burst forth in that interview with Bill Moyers that became hugely popular. I think it's the Jungian thing is almost it's a way to reach people very deeply. I also think he speaks to people bluntly, clearly, directly, and he's not caught up in a lot of emotional games. And our culture, this is another program for another time, but we're in a very romantic culture, by which I mean we so valorize feelings, and we so valorize not hurting people's feelings and all that. And Peterson stands for, I think, an older, nobler sort of spiritual tradition, that it's important for elders to speak the truth clearly and bluntly to people, even if it hurts their feelings. And I think men, especially young men, respond to that very readily. They don't like a lot of wimpy fussing about feelings all the time. They want to be told the truth by someone that clearly believes it. I think that's part of what his appeal is.
I thought of you a lot while reading this book and tracking this phenomenon, because in many ways it's an affirmation of a principle you've been screaming for years, which is not to dumb down the faith. You mentioned at the outset here that he doesn't use flashy audio visuals. He's not relentlessly upbeat. He doesn't give a comfortable, affirming message. He's not young and hip. It's just the opposite of all of these things, yet still people are drawn to him. It's an affirmation that when the truth is spoken, it's attractive.
Yeah, absolutely. And young men follow him. And now maybe in a future, maybe the next time we can talk about other reasons he's controversial, And I wouldn't deny that there are probably people that follow him, for bad reasons and all that. But I think to gather young men back into the, broadly speaking, spiritual fold is extremely important. We're recording this, not long after the terrible, most recent school shooting in Florida. And I remember reading an article that said, the boys are not all right. Now it's an overgeneralization, I know, but there's something wrong with young men in our culture. And watch The Fight Club sometime if you want to understand that phenomenon too, that it's not all right with the boys. And part of that is that boys are lacking manly spiritual leadership. And I think that's part of what Jordan Peterson brings.
We'll close with this. I want to dig a little deeper on that question of why he seems to be so effective at drawing young men to his work. Lots of people have commented that he seems to be the father figure that a lot of these young men are missing. Do you detect that?
Yeah, I do. Spiritual father, that's an archetypal principle. A kingly figure or a wisdom figure, especially for young men. Spirituality is not just women's work. Men are going to go out there and hunter. They're just the hunter gatherers. No, men have been involved in the spiritual tradition from time immemorial, but they need strong men to guide them. And I think he has emerged in a kind of funny way, a sort of unusual way, that this mild-mannered, professor from Toronto is a spiritual father to a lot of young men. But I think that's indeed happened.
Well, again, in the next episode, we're going to look more at Jordan Peterson and Catholicism, so starting to engage some of his ideas from a Catholic perspective. But I hope this sort of whet your appetite to learn more about Jordan Peterson, especially if you work with young people, if you're at all involved with college ministry, if you have young kids or teenagers, get to know Jordan Peterson and plug into that phenomenon, because chances are the kids that you're interacting with have probably heard of him or seen one of his videos.